Liver-eating Johnson was blood kin to the grizzly bear that bit Jim Bridger's ass, and you are molesting my podcast. The man known to some as the Crow Killer was many things: fur trapper, scout, guide, hunter, soldier, so-called Indian fighter, sometimes a good guy, sometimes a bad guy, possibly a cannibal, and always larger than life. Whole lot of tall tales surrounding this giant of a man, so please join me as we attempt to separate the fact from the fiction on this newest, I guarantee you'll learn something new, elk don't know how many legs a horse got, watch your top knot, yep, you watch yourn, episode of Bloody Beaver Podcast. John Liver-eating Johnson was born in New Jersey in 1824. Maybe. Or maybe it was 1831. Either way, he first came west to the Rocky Mountains in 1843. Wait, or was it 1862? Oh boy. Lots of information and misinformation to wade through on this episode. Lots of layers to peel before you can get to the real Liver-eating Johnson. Here's the thing, y'all. By the early 1860s, the liver eater was in Montana. And for the next 4 decades of the man's life, we got a pretty good idea of what he was up to. During those years, he prospected for gold, he served as a guide and a scout, he peddled whiskey, fought in the Civil War, and did a whole lot of fur trapping and hunting and fighting. It's Johnson's early life that's still pretty fuzzy, so please keep that in mind. Before we get to all those adventures in Montana, I will attempt to share a couple of different versions of John's younger years. And I know this episode's going to hurt a few feelings. We all love our heroes and our legends, but I do strive to get as close to the truth as possible on this podcast. That said, let me just go ahead and state for the record that Jeremiah Johnson never existed in real life. He's a made-up character for a movie, albeit a great movie, one of my favorites. I just watched it for about the 100th time a few days ago, and it is based mostly on 2 books: the fictional Mountain Man, written by Vardis Fisher, and Crow Killer, the saga of Liver-eating Johnson, written in 1958 by Raymond W. Thorpe and Robert Bunker. Crow Killer has been rated over 900 times on Amazon and currently holds a 4.6 out of 5-star rating. Not too shabby. Only problem is, it, just like the book Mountain Man, is a work of fiction. That in and of itself is not a bad thing. My favorite book of all time, Lonesome Dove, is also a work of fiction. And just like Crow Killer, it's loosely based on real people and events. It's entertaining, inspirational, it'll make you laugh, it'll make you cry. It is, in my opinion, one of the greatest stories ever told. But it ain't real. Let me try this from another angle. Y'all ever read any Tom Clancy books? One of my favorites was The Sum of All Fears. After I read it, I went and saw it at the movie theaters. And to my astonishment, the only thing that the movie had in common with the book was the title and the name of some of the main characters. That was it. In fact, the movie was so different from the book that on the DVD commentary, Tom Clancy introduces himself as the author of the book that the director ignored, and then kind of goes on to make light of all the inaccuracies and differences between the book he wrote and the movie. This, as far as I'm concerned, is what the book Crow Killer is to the real-life Liver-eating Johnson. And unfortunately, it is the story of the Crow Killer that a lot of people associate with the real-life Johnson. I really struggled with how to begin this episode because I didn't want to just come right out the gate and bash this book or try to rain on anyone's parade. But the true story of Johnson's life is fascinating and it is worth telling. It also just happens to be very different from the story put forth in Crow Killer, and as such, very different from the story that you'll find plastered all over the internet. The truth is, there is no record of Johnston or Johnson ever setting foot in Montana before around 1860 or so. He himself would claim 1862, and there's no proof that he ever killed any Crow warriors, much less hundreds of them, in a vendetta to avenge his dead wife, the wife that he himself would later claim he never had. And he almost certainly never ate human livers. Now, as far as the sources I used when researching this episode, I read The Never-Ending Lives of Liver-eating Johnson by DJ Herda, as well as Liver-eating Johnson, The Life and Legacy of the Famous Mountain Man by Charles River Editors. I also read The Avenging Fury of the Plains, John Liver-eating Johnston by Dennis J. McLelland. And I read parts of Crow Killer, the new edition with the foreword by Nathan E. Bender. And of course, numerous articles online. Another book that is often used as a source of information on Johnson's life that I did not read is titled I Buried Hickok by Joseph White-Eye Anderson. Because number one, Daddy can't read everything. And number 2, the copy I found on Amazon was over $100. However, in the book I just mentioned, The Never-Ending Lives of Liver-Eating Johnston, author DJ Herda does quote White-Eye's work several times. So I feel like I got a decent sense of it. And the book Crow Killer also uses these recollections of White-Eye Anderson as told to him by an old trapper named Del Gue regarding Johnston's life. Just keep in mind that I don't know much about Anderson. I have no idea if he was completely full of crap or a man of unquestionable honesty and integrity, or just somewhere in the middle. I did find out, however, that at times Anderson went by the name Oyster Johnny, a fact that adds absolutely nothing to this story other than I found it amusing and thought it made him sound like the type of guy who sells bootleg DVDs out the back of a Honda Accord. As I previously touched on, the book Crow Killer took many creative licenses when it came to telling the liver eater story. So much so that I do not find it to be a credible source. Unfortunately, it is their version that is the most prevalent, so we at least have to give it a quick look. And this will be the version most of you are going to be familiar with if you've read any of the many online articles or blogs covering Johnson, or if you're like me and you're just a fan of the movie Jeremiah Johnson. But first, let me say this. There are some things that pretty much everyone agrees with when it comes to John Johnston's early life, like the idea that his real name wasn't Johnston and that he was from New Jersey. And most researchers do agree that Johnston spent some time at sea, eventually joined the Navy, and deserted after striking a commanding officer. All right, so here we go. According to Crow Killer, Johnston was born in 1824 and made his way out west by 1843. He got outfitted in St. Joseph, Missouri with a good hawk and rifle and some overpriced traps and headed for the Rocky Mountains in search of that beaver. He was still a greenhorn at this point, but to his good fortune, he fell in with an experienced mountain man by the name of John Hatcher, who schooled him in the ways of trapping and survival. Shortly thereafter, John hooked up with another trapper by the name of Del Gue. Once again, if you've seen Jeremiah Johnson, this is sounding very familiar. He and Del Gue trapped together until the summer of 1847, when Johnston headed up to Flathead Country and married a young lady by the name of the Swan. The two lived happily ever after, or at least they would have, had not a Crow war party swept down one day while Johnston was out trapping and killed the Swan along with her and Johnston's child. You know where it's going from here. Johnston then wages a one-man war of vengeance upon the entire Crow nation, killing and scalping every single warrior responsible for the death of his family. And not only did he kill them and scalp them, but he also cut out their livers. Some say he ate the livers, raw. Others say he would take a bite out of the still warm organ and spit it out, declaring that crow liver ain't fit to eat. Still others claim that Johnston removed the liver as a way of ensuring that the dead warriors would never make it to the other side, forcing their spirits to roam the earth and never be at peace. After this initial vendetta, the Crow began to send their best warriors after Johnston, one at a time, and one by one he killed them all. Nobody knows how many Crow liver-eating Johnston killed, but estimates range from a couple of hundred to well over 1,000. This quarrel lasted nearly 20 years until finally Johnston rode into a Crow village alone and made peace. Now that's just a quick summary, but you get the picture. Another theme throughout the book Crow Killer is just how physically strong and imposing Johnston was. He was said to have been about 6 foot 2 inches tall and weighed in at over 240 pounds. All muscle, of course. For you MMA fans out there, this is roughly the same size as two-time heavyweight UFC champion Cain Velasquez. And Johnston was so strong, according to Crow Killer, that he actually had to take special care when hugging his friends so as not to hurt him. And just like Cain Velasquez, Johnston's hand-to-hand combat skills were next level. I don't know how many times the liver eater killed a man with just one punch, but it happened enough for the authors of Crow Killer to make note of it. There was one story where he killed 5 warriors in one fight using only his fists. And it wasn't just his hands that were deadly. The man was evidently one hell of a kickboxer as well. Not making this up, by the way. If you don't believe me on any of this, go get yourself a copy of Crow Killer and read it for yourself. Liver-eating Johnston killed many a man with just one swift and furious kick of the leg. Hell, there was even one time where he killed 2 opponents at the same time with just one kick. Not a grizzly bear, though, because that would be unrealistic. Nah, when it came time for him to kill an attacking grizzly bear, he dispatched the beast with his trusty Bowie knife. I mean, think about it. Are you really a mountain man if you haven't killed a bar with nothing but a knife? Both he and his horse could smell the, quote, engines from far away, and Johnston was known as the greatest manhunter and tracker in all of the Rockies. But when it came down to the actual fighting, he always gave his opponents a fair shot, or even an advantage. You know, sometimes he tossed them a weapon or let them draw first. And then there's the really believable story about the time he got kidnapped by the Blackfeet. They didn't kill him because they were planning on handing him over to the Crow for ransom, which makes total sense if you just ignore the fact that the Blackfeet and the Crow hated each other. But let's not let that get in the way. Story goes that Johnson overpowered the guard, killed him, and then ripped off one of his legs. He then escaped the Blackfoot village in the dead of winter, munching on the leg every now and then just to keep the hunger away. Good thing he didn't eat the whole leg, though, because he'd eventually have to use it to fight off both a grizzly bear and a mountain lion. Yes, you heard me right. John Liver-Eaton Johnston fought off a grizzly bear and a mountain lion using the severed and partially eaten leg of a Blackfoot warrior. And once again, this is all coming directly from the book Crow Killer. You get what I'm trying to say, right? Obviously, a lot of this just sounds kind of made up, like something you'd read in a really bad paperback Western. And okay, that's fine. We can chalk it up to the authors being a little overzealous. But then there's the other little stuff, like Johnson being schooled by the mountain man John Hatcher. According to everything I could find, the real-life John Hatcher was either down in Texas or New Mexico when they claim he was farther up north schooling Johnson on all things mountain man. And then there's Del Gue. Great character in Jeremiah Johnson, but there's not a whole lot of evidence that the man really existed. And for that matter, there's zero evidence that Johnston ever went to war with the Crow Nation, a tribe that's always been friendly not only with the mountain men, but the settlers that would soon follow. Hell, the U.S. Army would often utilize the Crow as scouts. About the most negative thing I've ever read about the tribe is that back in the day, if you weren't careful, they might steal your horses. And while there's no evidence that Johnson ever fought any Crow, there is ample evidence to the contrary. Evidence that shows he not only lived with them, but went to war with them against their common enemies, the Lakota and the Blackfeet. As far as having married the Flathead Maiden, Johnson would, later in life, claim to have never taken a Native American wife. Although, as I'll soon discuss, there is actually some evidence he might have been fibbing and actually had him a Crow wife at one point. He also denied ever eating human flesh numerous times, be it liver or leg. If you get your hands on a newer copy of Crow Killer, you can read the foreword written by Nathan Bender. It's pretty much a long disclaimer letting the reader know not to take anything in the book that seriously. And it compares their version of Johnson's life with the stories of Achilles or Beowulf, the stuff of legends. One last thing and we'll move on. There's a lot of debate about when Johnston was born. As I mentioned at the very beginning, some say it was 1824, while others say 1831. And there are sources that back up both years. If he were born in 1831, then obviously the whole thing about him going to war with the Crow is false because he would only been like 16 years old in 1847. Not nearly enough time to have been in the Navy, desert, head to the mountains, and find him a wife. If he were born in 1824, it's a little more plausible. However, we do have military records for the real-life John Johnston, and according to author and researcher Dennis McLelland, Johnston was still at sea in 1847, when the Crow allegedly killed his wife and child. As for when he actually arrived in Montana, friends would say that Johnston arrived there from the coast around 1860, and according to him, it wasn't until 1862. Although I found another version of Johnson saying that he didn't reach Montana until 1867. Are you confused yet? History sure does get complicated sometimes. Liver-Eaton Johnson was indeed a very real person. A man who, to paraphrase the aforementioned Dennis McLelland, was capable of both kindness and extreme violence. A larger-than-life character who, even taking away all the fluff and mythology, led a remarkably adventurous life. Oftentimes, Hollywood will take a real-life story and spruce it up to make it more exciting, right? Like how they did Hugh Glass in that movie The Revenant. It wasn't enough that the man got mauled by a grizzly and made this amazing journey of survival. Oh no. They had to turn it into a blood revenge story with Leonardo DiCaprio avenging the murder of his fictional son. With Jeremiah Johnson, it seems like they had to do the opposite. They had to dumb down the story they found in Crow Killer to make it believable. You didn't see Robert Redford fighting a mountain lion with a severed leg, and he sure as hell wasn't kung fu fighting. As I dug deeper and read more about the real-life Liver-Eaton Johnston, found him to be a pretty damn interesting guy. A guy who led a life that didn't need any fluff to make the man legendary. His is a story that doesn't need any Hollywood imagination to make it better. So alright, enough with the preamble. Let's discuss what I consider to be the more realistic story of John Liver-Eaton Johnston's early days. Remember, almost everybody believes he was born in New Jersey, not far from the town of Little York, in Hunterdon County in, like we've already said, either 1824 or 1831. I lean more towards 1831 for reasons I'll explain in a little bit. And Johnson's real name more than likely was William Garrison. Young Garrison didn't have an easy life as a kid. His father was a hard man who abused both the bottle and his son. As such, William took plenty of beatings at the hands of his old man, and as he grew older, was leased out to work for others, as to pay off his father's debt. A tradition I, for one, wish we could bring back. I can't help but think of my son. He spent so much time as a kid doing homework and playing video games and having meaningful interactions with kids his own age, forming healthy relationships that would help mold him into a normal, productive member of society, blah, blah, blah. Instead, I could have had him working off some of my credit card debt. No use crying over spilt milk, I guess. According to one neighbor, Garrison's father worked him, quote, nearly to the bone, until he finally had enough and lit out for greener pastures. By greener pastures, I do mean the open sea. A 14-year-old William took to using his brother's name, John, and found work on a whaling schooner sometime around the year 1838. And I had no idea how popular whaling was back in the day. Turns out people used old Moby Dick for all kinds of stuff. Whale oil could be used for burning lamps, as lubricant, or turned into a wax for candles. Whale bones were used in everything from corsets to umbrellas, whips, walking canes, brushes, even brooms. It would have been hard work for a boy just barely in his teens, but I can't help but think it would have been an exciting time for Garrison. If nothing else, it exposed him to a big, wide world outside of that tiny New Jersey bubble he'd been living in, and we can only imagine the various exotic ports he found himself exploring. Nobody can say for sure how long John worked as a whaler or what sort of adventures he got up to, but at some point, likely in the 1840s when the Mexican-American War was kicking off, he joined the Navy. A career that did end when he struck one of his lieutenants. Now, this earned him a 30-day stint in the brig, and once he was let loose, he bid the Navy adieu. Jumped ship, possibly in San Francisco, and went AWOL. Many sources hypothesize that this is when he took to calling himself John Johnston, changing his last name as to avoid the long arm of the law. By the way, as far as the name Garrison goes, as an older man, Johnson would confide in at least one person that was his real last name. And per official records, he did still have at least one sister in New Jersey at the time of his death. Also, there is a record of a John Garrison born in New Jersey who served on the frigate Raritan during the war. There's obviously no way to 100% prove this is our Johnson, but the experts do seem pretty confident. Still, though, plenty of speculation going on here. Also, how horrible is the name John Johnston as a made-up name? Just sounds like he kind of came up with it on the fly. Reminds me of that scene from The Office where Dwight Schrute says his dentist's last name is Crentist. Anyway, Johnston would eventually drop the T from his fake last name and just go by John Johnson. So if you hear me refer to him both as Johnson and Johnston throughout this episode, this is why. As far as him going AWOL, it does make sense. In the mid-19th century, there's a good chance he'd be sent to the gallows for physically assaulting a commanding officer. So him deserting and changing his name is all very believable, at least to me. The big questions are, when exactly did this happen? When did he finally make it to the Rocky Mountains? And what the hell was he up to in between? The Carbon County Democrat out of Montana is at least one source that stated that Johnson was in service during the Mexican-American War, which took place between 1846 and 1848. This, of course, is in direct contradiction to the story of him already being in the mountains and married to the Swan by this time. As far as I know, nobody knows for sure that Johnson jumped ship in San Francisco either. However, the Navy did enter the San Francisco harbor during the war as victors on July 9th, 1847. This could possibly have been when he deserted, or it could have been much later. Something I found very interesting, researcher Dorman Nelson says that Johnson was still at sea as late as 1858. And there's new research that reveals that Johnson may have been serving as a scout in Oregon in the late 1850s under General George Wright and his 9th Infantry. I'm still trying to find out more information on all of this. I have tried unsuccessfully to correspond with both Dorman Nelson and Dennis McLelland. I'm really hoping to speak with these guys eventually and pick their brains and find out more. When I do, you can rest assured I will share the findings with all of y'all. Now, with all this said, Johnson was supposedly one of the first gold seekers in Montana, in the areas of Bannock and Alder Gulch, where gold was discovered in 1862. And this lines up with Johnson himself claiming to have first set foot in Montana in 1862. And him being in the Navy as late as 1858 or serving as a scout in Oregon lines up with the story of him, as told by others, of having come to Montana from the coast. Alright, sorry if all of that was boring or confusing. I just wanted to establish a little bit of a backstory on the man. Even though some of it just seems to be mere speculation, and I haven't personally seen all of the documents that these claims are based on, it does seem a whole hell of a lot more believable and substantiated than the other version put forth in Crow Killer. Fortunately, like I said, we do have a much clearer idea about what the man got up to once he reached Montana, and it becomes a little bit easier to put all the pieces of the puzzle together. And while there's no record of Johnson striking it rich in the gold diggings of Alder Gulch, there are plenty of records of his time spent in the Union Army during the Civil War. Johnson left Montana and ventured on down to Benton Barracks, Missouri, where he enlisted in February of 1864 and served out the remainder of the war the next 18 months as a scout with Company H of the 3rd Colorado Cavalry. I have to pronounce the word cavalry like this because I'm tired of people telling me that I'm saying it wrong. Cavalry. And during the war, Johnson's unit basically helped protect the Kansas border and chase after Bloody Bill and Quantrell and their guerrillas. By the way, military records list Johnson as being 5 foot 11 and a half inches tall. This may have been taller than average at the time, but it kind of does squash the whole physical giant of a man legend. You know, he was a big guy, sure, but he weren't no giant. And when he enlisted, he did list his age as being 33 years old. This points towards 1831 as being the year of his birth as opposed to 1824. In the book The Never Ending Lives, author DJ Herda writes that Johnson lied about his age upon enlisting because his actual real age, 39, was too old for military service. Now, I'm not sure where Mr. Herda is getting this from. I did try to find out what the maximum age was to enlist in the Union Army, and I came up short. I couldn't get a definitive answer. But there's no way 39 was too old, especially towards the end of the war. I got to assume they were just taking every able-bodied man they could get their hands on. Even if there was a limit, I don't know, man. 39 just seems a bit too young for the cutoff point. I have a hard time believing that. Either way, Johnson did enlist and almost immediately went AWOL. Again, just like he did back in the Navy. Why? Not enough livers. That's why. He was told by his recruiter that he'd get at least 1 crow liver per day. And did they provide said livers? No, they did not. They tried to feed him nothing but fatback and corn dodgers, thus forcing Johnson to desert and go in search of human livers in an attempt to quench his insatiable hunger for mortal flesh. No, that's not true. He was listed as a deserter shortly after enlisting, but not for too long. Turns out this wasn't that uncommon. And I personally have an ancestor who's also listed as a deserter during the Civil War. And he, just like Johnson, appeared on the very next muster roll as present. Now, I've read and heard that sometimes these temporary desertions took place when there wasn't a whole lot of anything going on, and that sometimes soldiers would return home, plow their fields, see their families, and then head on back to their units. As far as Johnson goes, I have no idea what he was up to, but just like my ancestor, he was quickly back with his company, and neither one of them appeared to have ever faced any sort of punishment. By October of that same year, Johnson saw his first action, at least of this war, in the battles of Westport and Newtonia, Missouri, during which he was wounded twice, taking a rebel ball in both his shoulder and his leg. The shoulder wound in particular would dog him for the rest of his life. And thanks to military records, we know exactly what other ailments Johnson suffered from during the war. Other than being shot twice, he contracted a fever and the ague, then constipation and conjunctivitis, and more constipation and more conjunctivitis. Now, we all know what constipation means, but conjunctivitis is a fancy way of saying pink eye, which, according to records, Johnson got 4 times between March and December of 1864. Looks like liver-eating Johnson had an issue with scratching his booty hole and then rubbing his eyes. Old itchy butt Johnson. The ague, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, is a malarial fever, which he contracted in March of 64. Now, I don't know if he actually had malaria or that's just what they called the fever and the chills that were ailing him. Either way, it shows how shitty, literally, the conditions were in those Civil War camps. A lot of soldiers on both sides died from diseases unrelated to combat. Got to imagine Johnson couldn't wait to get back to the clean, crisp air of Montana, which is exactly what he did once he was honorably discharged at the war's end in 1865. Heading back to God's country and doing a little bit of gold prospecting and trapping, as well as working at various times as a teamster between Fort Benton and Helena. He also took to being a woodhawk at this time. Remember in the movie Jeremiah Johnson when Bear Claw tells Jeremiah that he can cut wood and leave it up on the Judith and that the riverboat captains will leave him gold? A good thing to know when times gets hard. That was woodhawking that Bear Claw was referring to. Woodhawks would cut, split, and sell wood to steamships headed up the Missouri River. It was this wood that was burned in the ship's firebox that created the steam that powered the paddle wheels. And most people don't realize it, but the phrase, got wood, comes from these steamboat days. When they were running low, they'd hang a sign from the starboard side of the ship that simply read, got wood, Question mark. If the woodhawks like Johnson saw the sign and they did indeed have wood, then they'd raise a flag that read, "I got wood." The steamboats would then pull to shore, and then they and the woodhawks would have one hell of a wood time. Right? Wood time? Wood? I made almost all that up. No, the woodhawks really did cut and provide wood for the steamboats, which really did require a lot of wood to power their paddles. According to the website that I forgot to bookmark, my bad, a trip from Louisville, Kentucky to New Orleans would burn 504 cords of wood. And in the year 1840, nearly 900,000 cords were cut and sold just in the areas where the Ohio and Mississippi rivers meet. Profitable, yet hard work. Out west in Montana territory, woodhawking wouldn't have just been hard work, but dangerous as well, especially in 1865. And especially smack dab in the middle of hostile country, which the upper Missouri at the mouth of the Musselshell, where Johnson had his camp, most definitely was in those days. This was Lakota territory, and this was also around the same time as Red Cloud's War and the Fetterman Massacre. Guys that looked like Johnson just wouldn't have been too popular on the upper Missouri. According to the U.S. Secretary of War, at least 7 woodhawkers were killed by Native Americans just in the summer of 1868 alone. And God only knows how many others rode out and were just never seen again. Even the always courageous liver-eating Johnson would say that during this time he, quote, slept with both eyes chalk wide open. Which made me wonder, if it was so dangerous, how'd he make it? How does one survive numerous attempts on their lives by a highly motivated foe that greatly outnumbers you? Johnson was lucky and he was tough, but those two attributes are only going to get you so far. I think he kind of had to be, as the outlaw Josie Wells once said, just plumb mad dog mean. Or you ever heard that saying, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil, for I am the evilest son of a bitch in the valley." Well, that was liver-eating Johnson in a nutshell. We may not know a whole hell of a lot about his younger years, and a lot of the stories of his exploits are greatly exaggerated, but the man's reputation as a relentless and brutal fighter did come honest, and it did come in those early days as a woodhawk. As you'll soon see, Johnson was one of these guys that not only relished a good fight, but really did not seem to know the meaning of the word fear. Furthermore, he never lost a moment's worth of sleep worrying about killing the hostile Native Americans upon whose land he was trespassing. And it was there, working as a woodhawk on the upper Missouri, that Johnson would finally earn his liver-eating nickname. And it didn't have a damn thing to do with the crow. It seems that one day in the year 1868, he and about 15 other men were set upon by a few hundred Lakota, and they had themselves a good old-fashioned fight. Things got a little hairy at one point, and Johnson sunk his trademark Bowie knife into a warrior's side. Story goes that when he pulled the blade out, a little piece of liver came with it. Johnson then proceeded to hold it up, show it to his friends, and loudly ask if anybody wanted to taste, before he then pretended to run the blade across his mouth. Thus, a legend and a nickname were born. Years later, and on several occasions, Johnson denied ever eating anybody's liver. He said that was a damn lie. And as far as that piece of liver coming out on a knife blade, well, he said that was unintentional on his part. But it wasn't just the liver incident or Johnson's actions during that fight, but what happened after that really caused his legend to blossom. According to him, they killed about 30 warriors. And not only did they scalp them, which was pretty common in those days, but they also dismembered them, cutting off their arms and legs. Then they cut off the ears and pickled them. And finally, they removed the heads, boiling them clean and placing the skulls on top of pikes with phrases written underneath like, "On the reservation at last," or "Horace Greeley knows I'm here." The mutilation of the dead Lakota wasn't completely without precedent. If you do any reading on the so-called Indian Wars, you'll see many accounts of the Native Americans doing the same thing to soldiers or settlers they happen to get their hands on, or other natives from enemy tribes. It's sort of the ultimate insult. You take your enemy's eyes so they can't see in the afterlife. You take their legs or their arms so they can't walk or harm you in the next world. And sometimes it's a way of sending a message. One of the theories about why the Comanche down in Texas were so brutal was that it was their way of sending the message, stay out of our land. Then there's that story of the trader who refused to help out some starving Sioux, telling them to go eat grass. Well, when they found the man's dead body after the Sioux got finished with him, his mouth was stuffed full of grass. That's a message. Then there's the story of Custer, whose inner ears were pierced with needles after he was killed, in the hopes that maybe he'd listen better in the next world. That's a message. And these messages were sometimes sent by the mountain men as well. I'm currently reading an excellent book called My 60 Years on the Plains, Trapping, Trading, and Indian Fighting by William Thomas Hamilton. And in the book, Hamilton describes an incident that occurred while he was on a fur trading expedition in the early 1840s. He and his party were being constantly harassed by this one tribe trying to steal from him, and eventually this same band just out and out attacked the trappers. They were able to drive the war party away, and then, after some discussion, they took the bodies of the dead warriors, piled them up, and burned them. The message they were sending was loud and clear. Do not fuck with us. This was the same message that Liver Eating Johnson, some 20 years later, was conveying with all those skulls on top of those poles, just in case any other Lakota war parties thought they might want to try to attack his little woodhawking camp. And as time went on, due to a variety of other reasons, Johnson did supposedly earn himself a reputation among both the Lakota and the Blackfeet as a man not to be trifled with. Reasons we'll get to in a moment. But first, just how many men did Liver Eating Johnson really kill? In The Avenging Fury of the Plains, author Dennis McLelland writes, quote, "During his prime, he, Johnson, had the reputation of being in more Indian battles than anyone of his day. It was said that Johnson had taken over 1,200 scalps over his frontier career. This author does not think it an exaggeration. Johnson's confidence in his abilities, his incomparable woodland skills, his bravado, and his utter disdain for his numberless foe propelled him to greatness among mountain men, and made him a legitimate object of fear and awesome respect to Indians." End quote. All right, fair enough. And I know I'm no author, and I don't mean any disrespect to Mr. McLelland, but this podcaster does think 1,200 scalps is an exaggeration. Who the hell kills 1,200 people? Not even Rambo killed that many people. Yeah, that's right, I checked. The fictional super soldier of the silver screen only killed 552 people on film. And that was with machine guns and helicopters and exploding arrows. Even if you evenly space out 1,200 killings over the course of 20 years, that comes out to like 5 people a month. What the hell did he do? Just set an alarm on his watch just in case? Just be mid-conversation and he'd go off and, hey, Delgue, I really want to finish this discussion, but hang on a second. I got to go kill me a redskin real quick. I did an episode a long time ago on the Bender family of Kansas. They were legit serial killers, and as a group, they only killed like 20-something people. Boone Helm, a damn murderous cannibal who, unlike Liver Eating Johnson, really did eat a man's leg, didn't even kill 20 people, much less 1,200. John Wesley Hardin, most likely a psychopath, might have killed 40 people? So this got me to thinking, who's the one person in history, one single individual, barring a dictator of course, who killed the most people? And it looks like it was this guy by the name of Vasily Blokhin. He was Joseph Stalin's chief executioner, and he was recorded as having killed tens of thousands of prisoners by his own hand, including 7,000 Polish prisoners of war just in the year 1940 alone. This lunatic had an execution room with padded soundproof walls and a sloping concrete floor with a drain in which he fulfilled his quota of 300 kills per night. It should come as no surprise that he eventually sank into alcoholism and mental illness, which resulted in suicide. So, that was a fun little rabbit hole to go down. Yay, history! But that's an extreme example of a truly evil person who, while he himself wasn't a dictator, was acting on behalf of one, and thus had the resources that come with such a position. But Liver Eating Johnson was just a frontiersman. I don't think he was evil or psychotic, and he damn sure didn't have a padded kill room or the full force of the military or government behind him. Still, I can almost hear it now, someone furiously typing away, leaving me a very angry comment on YouTube right now, defending Johnson's overinflated body count. So please, allow me to put it in perspective just a little more. And let's have a little fun while we're at it. Life's too short, and some of y'all be taking things way too seriously. Okay, so I mentioned Rambo's body count and how it didn't come close to the body count of Liver Eating Johnson. Well, how about not just Rambo, but all of Sylvester Stallone's characters combined? The Expendables, Judge Dredd, Demolition Man, Cobra, etc. Surely it comes out to a higher body count than that of Johnson. Ha! Nope. Try again. All of Stallone's on-screen kills only total 786. Alright, so if not Stallone, then who? Who in the fictional made-up world of movies has killed more people than Liver Eating Johnson? Of the top 15 actors whose characters have done the most killing, Clint Eastwood and Charles Bronson come in last. Combined, they only have a body count of 825. Next up is Jean-Claude Van Damme with 457. Then comes Chuck Norris with 458. Fucking pussy compared to Liver Eating Johnson. Next up is crazy-ass Nicolas Cage with 563 kills. And Wesley Snipes with 564. Now, this article I'm looking at comes from 2017, so I'm pretty sure Cage has surpassed Snipes by now. I won't bore y'all with the entire list, but you get the picture. Jason Statham, Steven Seagal, Schwarzenegger, Dolph Lundgren, The type of actors who star in movies with the most ridiculous and unrealistic scenarios involving magic guns that don't require reloading, outrageous explosions, car chases, fancy spy gear, and martial arts skills that defy the laws of physics, yet none of them, in all of their movies, killed as many people as Liver Eating Johnson did with just a simple black-powdered 50 caliber Hawken rifle. You see where I'm coming from, people? To actually find an actor whose characters are so ridiculously bloodthirsty and unbelievable that they surpass Johnson's supposed body count of 1,200, you have to go down the list to Mila Jovovich in the bizarro Resident Evil world. Now, in all actuality, Johnson himself stated that he was involved in over 40 fights with Native Americans, and that he never killed a white man, not even a Frenchman. Now, this seems a tad bit more believable, don't you think? Remember, this was real life. Nobody was waking up each and every morning and getting into gunfights. Not in Tombstone, not in Texas, and not on the Montana frontier. For someone like Johnson who spent time in wild places during a very wild time and was employed by an army who was actively pursuing hostile or presumed hostile Native Americans, 40 fights sounds about right. And it passes the smell test. It is true, however, that Johnson was no timid snowflake when it came to killing. Unlike the reluctant Jeremiah Johnson who refused to join Delgue in taking those Blackfeet scalps, no one ever had to tell Liver Eating Johnson twice. And asked later in life about why he killed so many natives, he said, quote, "During those early days out here, somebody had to be licked all the time. And after the fight was over, somebody had to be dead." All right, well, there you go. Johnson didn't just stick those skulls up on poles to scare away future war parties. It wasn't just a warning. Seems our Mr. Liver Eater also liked to shock and get a rise out of tenderfeet. Many a steamboat passenger found themselves aghast when they rounded a bend on the Missouri and saw Johnson standing there amongst the grinning skulls, wild-haired and whiskey-drunk and bare-assed. Yes, bare-assed. I found 2 separate accounts describing Johnson's total disdain for covering his nether regions. One of which goes, quote, "His entire attire consisted of a scant, much-shrunken red undershirt reaching just below his hips, and that his matted hair and brushy beard fluttered in the breeze." The other account said that as he would stand alone on the riverbank and watch the boats, his, quote, "costume generally consisted of one shirt, ballooned up by the wind, and whiskey-soaked, burr-matted beard." And it went on to say that he never acknowledged the need for trousers except in the wintertime. You know, at first it was hard to imagine Liver Eating Johnson without picturing Robert Redford. At least it was for me. But then the more I read about this guy and imagined him standing there on the shore, half-naked and looking like some sort of wild man, whiskey dripping from his beard and surrounded by scores of sun-bleached skulls and dried scalps, I started to see him as more of a Cormac McCarthy meets Apocalypse Now meets Jeff Bridges' a drunken Rooster Cogburn-like character. I'm convinced part of it was just for show. I think Johnson really did like to shock people. The other part of it was a strong case of not giving a damn. Had he wanted to live like a civilized gentleman and be burdened with their societal norms, he'd have stayed his ass in New Jersey. For better or for worse, Johnson was a free man, walking this earth exactly as he pleased, come what may. I guess there's a lot to be said about that. By the way, those ears he pickled would be sold to passengers on the steamboats once they recovered from their shock. And curiously enough, it was the female passengers who bought most of these grim trophies. Make of that what you will. Look, I'm not trying to say that all women are sociopaths, but they sure do like watching TV shows like Dexter and all those Lifetime movies where the jilted woman always gets away with murder. So, I'm just saying. Johnson would eventually get a little bit more creative, some might say efficient, in his various killing methods. There's at least one instance that's repeated so often, I have to believe it's at least partly true, where the Liver Eater poisoned some food with strychnine and left it as bait. Some Lakota warriors, coming upon it and thinking they were stealing his food, ate it and they all died. There's another story where he did the same with the Blackfeet. Another less believable but oft-repeated tale is how he always had secret passageways underneath his cabins, allowing him a place to hide or a way to sneak out without being seen. After that poisoning incident, the Lakota were so incensed with Johnson that they came at him full force and basically had him under siege in his own cabin. He eventually ran out of food and would sneak out at night to secure more. After one of these foraging trips, he came back to find that several warriors were inside of his cabin. So he opened up fire on them all of a sudden, taking them by surprise. Those who could flee attempted to do so, but he was able to pull at least one back inside and began ripping and mutilating the body apart with his teeth and drinking of the warrior's blood. I highly doubt this actually ever happened. But I wonder, did Johnson or any of his friends ever purposely spread these lies just to further build up his reputation as a man not to be messed with? Possibly, or maybe they were just entertaining themselves. Mountain men were notorious liars when they spoke to pilgrims. Pilgrims, by the way, being anyone who wasn't one of them. The stories that these wild men used to tell around campfires and at the trappers' rendezvous are legendary. Oh, I forgot to mention, Johnson also used a scope on his rifle, a not-so-common thing back in those days that would only increase his already lethal accuracy. And he himself would often speak of a story of how he laid in ambush and picked off Indians from a distance as they tried to flee. With all of these things combined, Johnson's lack of fear, his brutality when it came to the bodies of his fallen enemies, his ruthlessness in continuing to fire on fleeing enemies, his accuracy while doing so, and his willingness to go places, oftentimes alone, that no other white men would dare to venture to. It's no wonder he gained a certain amount of mythology. And add on a bunch of highly exaggerated stories, boom, got yourself a legend. Also, you got to imagine that as time would progress and after several retellings, each story would get a little bit more inflated. Remember the movie Unforgiven? How that lady of the night got her face cut up by the drunk cowboy after she laughed at his little pecker? Once the kid caught up to Clint Eastwood and shared the story, it wasn't just that she got her face cut up, but that she also had her eyes and ears cut off. Hell, they even cut off her teats. By the time Clint Eastwood got around to telling the story to Morgan Freeman, it had blown up to the point that the cowboys had basically cut off everything but her little pink canoe. I think Johnson's reputation was built in the same way. He was wild and he fought hard and ruthless and by his own set of rules, for sure. And whoever was around to witness it, for sure, took extra liberties in retelling the stories. Anyway, it was a reputation that quickly grew. From about 1869 to 1873, Johnson took a break from woodhawking and started selling bootleg whiskey. By this time, his home base was Fort Benton, located on the upper Missouri about 40 miles northeast of the present-day town of Great Falls, Montana. And Fort Benton was first established in 1846 as a fur trading post and became part of the overland link between the Missouri and Columbia rivers. For a good 30-year period, it was a stop-and-off place for steamboats carrying people from far and wide, gamblers, traders, miners, big city dudes, preachers, and whores. And there were also plenty of Native Americans conducting trade in the vicinity as well. If you want to get a good idea of life at Fort Benton, please check out the book My Life as an Indian by James Willard Schultz. It's his true account of his time spent there, living with, and eventually marrying into the Blackfeet tribe. Amazing book, one of my favorites. And after researching this episode, I know for a fact that Schultz would have at very least known of Liver-Eating Johnson. More than likely, though, the two men knew each other. So if I have time, I really want to go back and reread that book again and see if I can make the connection. A lot of the names of real people were changed purposely by Schultz, so nobody got implicated or got their feelings hurt. But yeah, definitely going to revisit that book and find out. Give it a read if you get a chance. Many of the men who resided at Fort Benton would either trade for furs with the local tribes or organize fur trapping expeditions themselves out in the wilderness. And I'm sure Johnson did both of these as well. By the way, all these things I mentioned him doing for a living, the teamster work and the woodhawking and even later on the scouting, one constant was that he was always trapping as well. Trapping and hunting were always kind of his bread and butter. Also, just real quick, since we're talking about trapping, I do want to mention that all this fur trapping and trading I'm speaking of and Johnson's time on the frontier all took place after what we think of when we think of the classic mountain man or fur trapping days. Guys like Jim Bridger, Kit Carson, Broken Hand Fitzpatrick, Beckworth, Jed Smith, Old Bill Williams. These guys all came west back in the 1820s and 30s. That's when the beaver felt hats were all the rage in Europe and back east, and these men were getting top dollar for their hides. By the time the liver eater made it to Montana, those days were long gone. There were already a ton of forts and towns popping up, stage lines, farms, settlers, and railroads, and all that kind of jazz. Even if you still want to hang on to the idea that Johnson ventured out to the frontier in 1843, like the book Crow Killer claims, this would still be after the prime beaver trapping days. There were still beaver, of course, and you could still sell the hides. But they weren't getting top dollar, and you didn't even have your mountain man rendezvous anymore by this point. By the mid-1840s, a lot of your former trappers had already begun transitioning into traders or guides and scouts. Just wanted to throw that out there. As far as Johnson's whiskey selling operations go, this took him up the infamous Whoop-Up Trail, crossing Blackfeet land and on up into Alberta, Canada. Not only was this just as dangerous as being a woodhawk, but it was also illegal as hell. There's at least one account of a U.S. Marshal and a troop of cavalry attempting to arrest Johnson while he was peddling his liquor. Much like Wyatt Earp in the movie Tombstone, Johnson let the lawman know that he wasn't in the mood to be arrested that day. A standoff ensued and the marshal went home empty-handed. After that, Johnson's little whiskey-selling camp on the Belly River became known as Fort Standoff. Now, this whiskey was typically hauled on the back of mules or via wagons in 5-gallon kegs. Most whiskey smugglers would travel at night and lay low during the day, probably out of fear of both the local natives and the army. This whiskey would be purchased in Montana for $3 a gallon and then sold in Canada for 5 times that amount. Now, I had never heard of the Whoop-Up Trail previously. Check it out if you get a chance. There was even a fort up there in Alberta called Fort Whoop-Up. It was basically just a liquor trading stronghold. They'd sell whiskey spiked with ginger, molasses, red pepper, and even chewing tobacco to the local tribes. And from what I read at least, this illegal operation was part of the reason that the Royal Canadian Mounted Police were formed. Really interesting stuff, but also really sad when you consider the lasting devastation that alcohol had on the First Nations and indigenous people of North America. Even today, per an article I found on recovery.org, Native Americans have some of the highest rates of alcohol and drug abuse among minority groups. Obviously, and unfortunately, this wasn't very much of a concern to those guys making money off of whiskey at this time. As you can imagine, with all of Johnson's wanderings that he undertook while out on these money-making ventures, he got to know Montana territory pretty well. As good, if not better, than any other white man during this time. This led to scouting opportunities. If there was someplace you wanted to go, he'd be the man to get you there. All right, y'all, that seems like a pretty good cutoff point. I wasn't planning on making this a 2-part series, but the whole thing ended up being way longer than I thought, so I decided to split it up. Please stay tuned for part 2 of the Liver-Eating Johnson story, coming soon. What will that scamp Liver-Eating Johnson get up to next? How many crow livers will he eat on that guiding expedition? Only one way to find out. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Till then, thank you so much for listening. Please email me at bloodybeaverpodcast@gmail.com or head on over to bloodybeaver.com and hit that contact button. Share this podcast with someone. Also, if you're on Facebook, do me a favor and spread the word on there as well, because I don't know how to use Facebook. I know they have Old West or Wild West groups on there where they talk about this kind of history. Just don't, go in there and break any rules or piss anybody off. All right, till next time, y'all, I'm about to go eat about 10 livers real quick. Is Libby still open?